minhas contas e da Lu, esse é o encontro de número 78 do Tiaços.
Nossa!
Incrivelmente, conseguimos chegar nesse número, trazendo para o Brasil uma série de convidados de alto valor, reconhecimento, prestígio, junto também com a possibilidade de dar voz a novos personagens do mundo junguiano brasileiro, contemporâneo. Então, ratificando a minha imensa alegria no meu nome, no nome da Lu e da Isa, do Projeto Tiaços. E hoje, nada menos do que recebermos Murray Stein de Tiaços. Uma grande alegria, Murray, te receber, um nome pilar, né? Um nome de fundamentação, uma referência dentro do campo junguiano, uma imensa alegria recebê-lo. Murray, vou fazer as honras da casa primeiro de modo tradicional, vou te apresentar como se alguém não ainda o conhecesse. Murray Stein é analista de treinamento e supervisão na Escola Internacional de Psicologia Analítica de Zurique, foi presidente da Associação Internacional de Psicologia Analítica e presidente do ISAP Zurique, e leciona internacionalmente. Ele é o autor de vários livros, Mapa da Alma, do Jung, Mind in the Self, Outside, Inside and All Around, e muitos outros livros e artigos. 4 volumes dos seus escritos coletados foram publicados até hoje. Murray mora na Suíça e tem um consultório particular em Zurique e em sua casa em Goodwill. Eu trouxe alguns livros do Murray publicados em português. Queria apresentá-los aqui para vocês. Consciência Solar, Consciência Lunar, o livro mais antigo, né, do Murray, um livro editado por ele junto com Nathan Schwartz-Sala, Transferência e Contra-Transferência, Tempo e Eternidade, Psicanálise Junguiana, que é um livro editado pelo Murray Stein, um belíssimo livro publicado agora em português, e um recém-traduzido, onde o Murray também organiza, junto com Thomas Ast, o livro vermelho de Jung para o nosso tempo. Esses livros estão todos em português, e, além deles, há toda uma vasta publicação do Murray Stein. Eu queria sublinhar as obras completas dele, que estão saindo pela Quiron, em 4 volumes. Esses são os 2 primeiros, Individuação. Volume 2, Mito e Psicologia. Eu acho que tem mais 2 volumes, né, Murray? Transformação e Prática Clínica, né? Acho que são mais 2 volumes. Enfim, um prazer te receber, Murray. Uma alegria ter você conosco. Sempre uma oportunidade de imenso conhecimento, de imensa troca, poder ter você conosco. Espero que você goste. Seja bem-vindo. A palavra é sua. Obrigado pela presença.
Thank you, Marcus. Such a generous introduction. It would be nice to be with you in Brazil. I'm in Switzerland today. I have visited Brazil on a couple of occasions. When I was president of the IAP, came to Rio and to Sao Paulo and a couple of other cities in Brazil. Always enjoyed my time there very much. The lecture I'm going to give today is titled The Union of and Animus in Alchemy and the Individuation Process. And in this lecture, I'm going to consider the topic of the union of anima and animus as it's graphically depicted in the alchemical series of pictures titled Rosarium Philosophorum. Some of these are images that Jung used to discuss the analytic relationship in his late work, The Psychology of the Transference. That's in volume 16 of Jung's collected works. I will be speaking, however, not of the analytic relationship, but rather of the intrapsychic dimension, where anima and animus are united within the individual psyche. This is a process that is essential in what we as Jungian psychoanalysts and psychotherapists speak of as individuation in the second half of life. In Jungian psychology, the terms anima and animus refer to archetypal patterns of libido, psychic energy, at a level of the unconscious that we call the collective unconscious. When we use these terms, therefore, we're speaking about features of the psyche that are only somewhat directly available to consciousness and are energically totally independent of the ego's control. We can experience them, the anima and the animus, in dreams, in active imagination, and of course in projection, and also indirectly in literature, fairy tales, myths, film, and so forth, where we are invited to project ourselves into constructed narratives. These archetypal images appear in many guises, and when we look for them in ourselves, we have to observe our psyches carefully to locate their effects upon us. In his writings, Jung often uses shorthand definitions. He says the anima is the feminine side of a man's psyche, and the animus is the masculine side of a woman's psyche. But this is actually an oversimplification, and we're going to consider them in a more strictly archetypal way as belonging to both biological genders. Both men and women have both our animus and anima archetypal patterns in their psyches. So I will begin with what Jung calls the syzygy in his late work, Ion. That's in volume 9 of the collected works. Syzygy means an intimately connected pair, a twosome. There are two figures, but they are formed as a single unit. Think for the moment of the anima and the animus as aspects of a single unit, as two sides of a globe. On the one side, you find the face of the animus, and on the other side, the face of the anima. In Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, there you will find the myth that says that human beings were originally two-sided creatures. Some of them on one side were male, and on the other side, they were female. At some point, they were divided and lost contact with one another. And thereafter, they spend their entire lives looking for each other, longing to reunite and come back together, again, to form a single unit. We can think of the anima and animus in this way when we consider them in the individuation process. Once they were together, then they were separated, and finally they come together again. This is a developmental process. The Christian doctrine of God as a Trinity is similar, only it has three persons in its unity rather than two. Originally, there was a unity. Then there was a separation of persons, and then they return to a unity again. This is considered the unfolding of the divine revelation. It's a movement into consciousness. Now, the psychological idea is that we are born with a self that is complex, but undifferentiated and mostly potential at the beginning. Like the acorn, we come with all the germ material that we will have and use in the course of our development. If you cut an acorn in half, you don't find a little tree inside that will grow big in time. You find the germ material that will eventually develop and grow into a full-fledged oak tree. It's the same with the original self, the primal self, as Michael Fordham calls it. It comes into being when you are conceived and formed in your mother's womb. Eventually, you are born with the psychological potential that you will then elaborate and develop in the course of your lifetime. Alchemy speaks about this rich potential as prima materia, and we think of it as the prime matter out of which the individuation process will eventually develop and grow into a full human personality. Now, Jung speaks of the self as a container and the center of what will in time become arranged pairs of opposites once the process of differentiation begins in the prima materia. In the original pleromatic state of the psyche, there is no differentiation among the potentials and future contents. It is what the alchemists called a massa confusa, where everything is thrown together and unseparated. It is a state of pure potential. Then there comes a period of differentiation as another principle enters into play, and Jung calls this the principium individuationis, or the individuation principle. Or in the first of the Septem Sermones ad Mortuis, he calls it the creatura principle. Psychologically, it is the emergence of consciousness within the self. The animus and the anima are originally one as a syzygy, and then they develop into a pair of opposites within that structure and in the pleromatic state. As they differentiate, they divide and become two distinct energy patterns that will flow into the libido distributions in the personality in their own particular ways. The animus as spirit, or logos, and the anima as soul, or eros. The animus is active and separates, and as logos it distinguishes and refines. The anima is receptive, and as eros it relates and connects. The animus becomes our bright solar consciousness. The anima, our dim lunar consciousness. The animus is associated with the masculine principle, and the anima is associated with the feminine principle. We should keep these somewhat separate from biological gender differences, however. They are psychological and not biological components of ourselves. Everyone has both types of consciousness in their psychic repertoire. As an individual personality develops in the first half of life, the dominant attitude and identity that forms in ego consciousness tends to prefer one or the other of this polarity. Either it gravitates toward the feminine anima side or the masculine animus side. Then after midlife, this changes, and both are equally represented. That's the ideal pattern. It's important to keep in mind that these are archetypal energies and not personal dispositions only. That is, they transcend ego consciousness and belong to the general level of the human endowment. They are psychic principles that affect all human beings everywhere and throughout history equally. They influence us, and we do not control them. In the traditional picture of human culture, girls would identify with the feminine side or the anima side of the syzygy and become representatives of it. They take it into their conscious feelings about themselves as little girls, then young women, and later as mothers, then grandmothers, then wise old women, and so on. They have a developmental trajectory based on their identity with the anima side of the syzygy. And boys would take up the animus side of the syzygy and develop their identities and features of their personality around it. When boy meets girl and they develop an intimate relationship, they are restoring the unity of the original syzygy. And we speak of them as soulmates. The two separated halves find each other and come together again. This is a story of the reunion of anima and animus on the interpersonal level. It symbolizes the deeper story that takes place in the unconscious of each of them. We will now take a look at the story on the intrapsychic level. What is most interesting is that the reunion is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a process of transformation that changes both anima and animus. The reunion is the beginning of a profound transformation in the individual psyche. This is the story we can study in the 20 pictures of the Rosarium Philosophorum. We must also keep in mind that inner reflects outer, and outer reflects inner. Interpersonal reflects intrapsychic, and intrapsychic reflects interpersonal. They need each other. In other words, what we do in our interpersonal life has a direct bearing on what happens in our inner life, and vice versa. That's why Jung said that you cannot individuate by sitting alone on top of a mountain. Human interaction is a necessary ingredient in the process. Now I'm going to share my screen and we will look at the slides of the Rosarium Philosophorum. Let me just enlarge that. And go there. The Rosarium Philosophorum is an alchemical document that dates from the 16th century, around 1550, the Common Era. It was written and published in Frankfurt, Germany, as you can see here on the screen. And there are a total of 20 pictures in this alchemical text called the Lapis Philosophorum. These are the 20 pictures that we will consider. We'll go through all 20 pictures But at the outset, let me give you just this overview. The pictures can be divided into 4 parts, as you see on the screen, 4 levels. Pictures 1 to 3, then 4 to 10, and then 11 to 17, and then 18 to 20. So 3 and 2, 4, 6, and 6 and 3. 7. So 7, 3, 7, 7, and 3. The first 3 pictures are preparation for the process. The 7 pictures following, pictures 4 through 10, show the transformation of Luna, the queen, that is the Anima. Soul, the Animus, participates in this, and the next set of 7 pictures, 11 through 17, show Soul's transformation. Luna is the moon, Sol is the sun. Also with Luna's participation. And the last 3 pictures, which represent the 4th and final movement of the process, depict transformation through death, number 18, sublimation and integration, number 19, and rebirth in a transformed body, number 20. I will try to explain the psychology of this process in detail as we go through the pictures one by one. The first picture is called the Mercurial Fountain. This is where the process takes place, in this container. You see the 4 stars in the corners of a picture symbolizing totality. 4 stars in the corners. You see the sun and the moon above on left and right. So that represents the Animus and the Anima. The fountain with 3 spouts coming out of it, and the mercurial water in the basin of the fountain. The inscription along the rim of the basin shows that Mercurius flows out of the 3 pipes in the form of the virgin's milk, the spring of vinegar, and the water of life. It is in this mercurial water that the king and queen will bathe and unite. In the second picture of the series, we meet the protagonists in the story, the king and queen. They are fully clothed in their royal personae, and they meet as equals. You can see they're on equal footing, about the same height, and so on. The king represents Sol, the sun, splendor of solar consciousness. He is the Animus, the archetype of spirit, the ruler of the world and the ruler of collective consciousness. His power and authority lie in his matchless will. He meets the queen, regaled in his official robes of office. Similarly, the queen is dressed in her official capacity as ruler of the lunar world. This is the world of dreams, of aesthetics, of relationships, of imagination. Hers is a magical world of subtle connections through unconscious attachment. She favors body over mind. She is as fully developed as is the king. They are not beginners with potential for growth in stature and identity before them, but rather fully realized archetypal powers. Here you see the Animus and the Anima in all their power and commanding authority coming together. You could say they're meeting defensively, formally, clad in the armor of persona, except they are holding hands with their left hands while they are crossing swords with their right hands. It is in this left-handed connection between them that we begin to get the story that tells of a secret and hidden relationship between them. They are brother and sister, and this is a reunion of who they once were together, twins. Jung speaks of it as an incestuous relationship that is reserved for royalty. As Animus and Anima, they were once two aspects of a syzygy when they were in the womb of the self. Now they are coming together again. Above them is a star, which symbolizes a spiritual blessing on this union. The dove is a Holy Spirit that presides over their union. It symbolizes the blessing of the self. This is meant to be. This slide, picture number 3, is titled The Naked Truth. King and Queen have removed their persona and are now meeting one another in a much more exposed and less defended manner. Here they are not holding hands anymore, but they're in contact with each other, and the dove is still above them. The king says, "O Luna, let me be thy husband." And the queen replies, "O Sol, I must submit to thee." The dove above them declares himself as the unifying spirit. We want to reflect for a moment what it means to strip away the personas of the king and queen. The queen, which is the anima side of the syzygy, tends to prefer attachments to the body and to others. The king, which is the animus side, tends to prefer domination and will over others. Also tends to become attached to ideas and concepts, to spiritual elements in the collective atmosphere. In order to unite, both must shed their attachments. The soul, Anima, must liberate herself from the attachments to the material world and its pleasures, and focus her desire for attachment on the spirit, the Animus. The spirit, Animus, must liberate himself from attachments to will to power and collective opinions of the day, and focus his desire on the soul, on the Anima. This was Jung's move when he left the spirit of the times and followed the spirit of the depths in his Red Book, Experiment and Experience. The shedding of previous attainments and attachments, whether material, attachment to the body, to beauty, to possessions, or attachment to culture, opinions, ideas, concepts. This shedding of the attachments is the condition for entering into this union of soul and spirit, anima and animus. It is a shedding of the past in order to transform into a new being. In the first half of life, the task is to get into the world, to get into life. The soul has to be seduced into life and become attached, first to the mother and father, then to the wider family and friends, then to peer groups in the culture. It's very important that the soul enters into life, becomes active in the world and attached to things of this world. Similarly, it is important for the animus to develop the will, to take charge of decisions about the course of life, to develop a viewpoint that conforms to the spirit of the times, the cultural norms and values. All of this is developmentally important. And therapists help their clients to do this necessary work of becoming attached and adapting to the world around them, to developing a persona. But upon entering into the second half of life, in order for a united mentality to develop, a strong separation needs to take place. The soul, the alchemist says, has to be separated from the body and united with the spirit. And the spirit must bend itself toward the soul and relate to the values of eros and relationship. The way the alchemists imagined and described this is contained in their writings and drawings, such as the set we are looking at here. For a period of time, there is a wrenching and difficult process called separatio. And this is the midlife crisis. There is a crisis of meaning and animus differentiation. And emotional life becomes confused and even absent for a period of time. It's a very difficult passage. But when that is done, a new perspective becomes possible. This liberation from previous attainments frees the mind from its shackles and bondage to the past and its conditioning. This is where we are in picture number 3 of the Rosarium. They have put aside their past and now are ready to embark on a new life together. In picture number 4, titled Immersion in the Bath, the conjunctio process begins. The preliminaries are over. The 2 naked figures, Sol and Luna, again with a dove, get into the mercurial bath together. The water is a solvent that will remove any remaining resistances. This water is similar in function to what the Greeks said about Dionysus, the god of wine and intoxication, that he is the great loosener, they called him, the great loosener. Wine breaks down the inhibitions to unite. These inhibitions exist as necessary defenses to protect the integrity of boundaries. They are essential for the maintenance of identity and freedom. But if there is to be a profound union, and not just a momentary exchange, the boundaries must dissolve. This will change the outcome from a mixture to a compound, to use chemical terms. This picture signals that the process of transformation will be effective. This leads immediately to picture number 5, the conjunction. Here you see a graphic image of king and queen in a conjugal embrace, having intercourse and approaching the moment of union. And notice that they speak to one another. O Luna, folded in my sweet embrace, be you as strong as I, as fair of face. And she replies, O Sol, brightest of all lights known to man, and yet you need me as the cock the hen. It is the sun speaking to the moon, and the moon responding to the sun. They are reflecting each other's value. He is giving her his brilliant light, and she is both admiring him and reminding him that he needs her in an instinctual way. It's interesting that she brings the language of instinct. Instinct is necessary for wholeness. solar consciousness is not self-sufficient. This tells us that we are incomplete without our instinctual parts, as much as we may like to believe that we can become pure spirit. And it is in this very graphic embrace that Saul realizes how deeply Luna contributes to the realization of wholeness. They both need each other, and they submit to each other in this embrace. In picture number 6, we see the result of the union. The two figures have become one. This is called conception or putrefaction. Conception, the word is promising, but putrefaction sounds very negative. This is an ambiguous state of being. It's a death of differentiated identity, which is at the same time a preparation for a new state of consciousness that is not based on the earlier difference between animus and anima attributes. In this picture, you see two heads, one trunk, two arms, and two legs. The image of two heads suggests some continuing differentiation, but both feed into and rely upon a single body, so they must work together in an altogether new way. This is the new being, and it will continue as such to the end of this part of the series. The text reads, "Here lie the king and queen dead. The soul is separated with great grief." In a sense, the goal of union has been achieved, but the resulting body is placed in a coffin. So it is in a liminal state of being. That is what one faces during major transitional periods in life, such as midlife and old age, when a previous one-sided identity has been called into question and a new identity has not yet fully emerged. It is the chrysalis stage, to use the metaphor of a caterpillar's transformation into a butterfly. The alchemists referred to this as the negredo state, blackness. In the next picture, we see the new soul that they have created between them flying upward into the heavens and away from the body. This is titled The Extraction of the Soul and Impregnation. It's a curious concept. On the one hand, the soul is leaving the body, and this symbolizes death. On the other hand, the soul is moving upward into the realm of transcendent spirit. We know it will return in a later picture. So this is a continuation of the state shown in picture number 6 and adds to the definition of liminality as a state of incubation. The text reads, "Here the four elements are separated, and the soul is most subtly separated from the body." The couple has died to their old identities, and in this liminal time, it's a period of waiting for the new to become viable. They are dying to their old selves, and they are going to be reborn to a new self. In picture number 8, the washing phase begins, which signals the preparation for the return of the soul that left the bodies in the previous stage. The body is being prepared for renewal in the next stage of life. The alchemists would speak of this as the albedo stage, the whitening. The darkness of night gives way to the light of dawn. One can also think of springtime, when plants begin to show new life after the dead time of winter. The moisture that is falling on the dead body will bring new life. The text reads, "Here the dew falleth from heaven, and washeth the black body in the sepulchre." You see that revival coming about and taking hold in picture number 9. There are 2 ravens at the bottom. One is buried with just a head sticking out. The other is totally out and free. This indicates that the process is not complete, but the soul is coming back and the united being is being vivified, brought back to life. The text reads, "Here the soul descends from on high and revives the putrefied body." The symbolism of the death and rebirth archetype is prominent here. The revived body is shown in picture number 10, called the rebus. The rebus is a symbol of the union of soul and spirit, anima and animus, in a living form. The androgynous nature of this being is on full display. One body with 2 heads, both crowned. In this picture, you see the reunited syzygy, triumphant and standing on the moon. This is the lunar rebus, with the accent on the transformation of the anima side of the syzygy. What does this mean, psychologically speaking? The text offers a suggestion. Here is born a rich and noble queen, whom the wise men liken unto their daughter. She increaseth and bringeth forth infinite children. This signals the emergence of an incredibly fertile and creative energy within the anima archetype. This is what poets like Maria Rainer Rilke, for instance, wait for, an inner femme inspiratrix to stimulate their poetic spirit. The ancients called her a muse. She brings intuitions and dreams and inspires imagination, motivating the psyche to acts of spontaneous creativity. In the Bible, she is named Sophia, the feminine figure who was with God at the creation of the world. Psychologically, this means that the anima has been successfully separated from attachments to objects in the material world and has been united with the animus. She has been liberated and transformed by her new attachment to the animus. Soul and spirit now exist in a state of mutuality and unity. In conscious life, this brings an attitude of freedom from the obsessions about everyday life in the immediate world surrounding a person. It does not mean uncaring or indifference, but rather what the Buddhists call liberation. Jung would say it means freedom from domination by complexes that obsess and control our emotional life. Now, this is the conclusion of the first phase of the transformation process. With picture 11, we begin the second major phase of the unification of Sol and Luna. In this phase, Sol, the sun, undergoes a process of transformation similar to what Luna underwent in the previous phase. This is the second conjunctio, similar to the previous one, but with some important differences, as we will see. In this picture, the transformed Luna is in the upper position with Sol beneath her, and both are winged, indicating the advanced stage of both figures. This second union takes place on a level that is less instinctual and more spiritual than the first. The archetypal dominates here and overshadows the instinctual. The process has moved to another level. The text reads, "Here Sol is again included and is circumpassed with the Mercury of the philosophers." The animus is brought back into the process and will undergo the transformation engendered by Mercurius, who is the symbolic representative of the self. Mercurius, the spirit of the unconscious, is the agent of transformation in alchemy. And this will be a philosophical transformation. The animus will be affected on the level of ideas. We have to take ideas here as archetypal elements on a plane with archetypal images. The philosophical mind is an archetypal mind. That is a mind that is in contact with the world of the archetypes. We can think of it as a Platonic mind rather than an empirical mind. This emphasis on the symbolic and the archetypal does not exclude the physicality of the union, as we see well enough in the picture, but the wings on the figure stress the symbolic nature of the union. This is based, it should be said, on the earlier transformation that has already taken place. The physical has been taken up or sublimated into the realm of spirit. Picture number 12 is again a death scene, and it's a parallel to picture number 6. And there ensues now a series of pictures in which the corpse of the androgyne is featured. Here you see the shining head of the winged Saul resting on a tomb. And the text reads, "Here Saul dies again and is drowned with the mercury of the philosophers." Again, the mercury of the philosophers is adduced, and this is the reason the picture is titled Illumination. This is a moment when Saul descends into the darkness of the grave and there experiences the light of the darkness and becomes what the alchemists called the Sol Niger, the black sun. It's a moment in the process where the light of day is extinguished and the light of darkness is perceived as a new type of consciousness, an illumination. It might be what times of depression can teach us about the deeper meaning of life, or it could be compared to an experience of the void in Buddhist meditation, which can also be quite dark and threatening, a kind of death of the ego's usual consciousness. The next picture is titled Nourishment. So this seeming death is looked upon as a positive development. The alchemists would say, rejoice when you arrive at the Negredo. The process is working. The text for picture 13 reads, here Saul is made black like unto pitch with the mercury of the philosophers. This is Sol Niger, the black sun. It is a state of depression, emotionally speaking, but also an experience of enlightenment in the light that is of the darkness itself. This experience nourishes the spirit. Paradoxically, it adds the dimension of depth. It inaugurates what we call depth psychology, a vision of life from the perspective of the unconscious. That's what depth psychology is, looking at life from the perspective of the unconscious. It is quite clear why the anima has to be put through a death, cleansing, and rebirth process. It is in order to separate from attachments to the material world, the body. But why does the animus need to be put through a similar process? What does the animus need to be separated from? The answer, I would suppose, is that the animus, which as an archetype underlies the solar mind and therefore underlies ego consciousness, becomes contaminated by what Jung called the spirit of the times. Consciousness gets filled up with collective opinions and views, And these accoutrements are fed into the unconscious background, that is the animus, and they need to be washed away. Much of our education is a process of filling our minds with the thoughts of the past, of the cultural consensus, of collective attitudes, biases, and prejudices. When we say that someone is animus possessed, be it man or woman, this is what we are referring to. These notions are what we think of under the guise of being rational. And we cannot get out of this collective mentality as long as we travel in these well-trodden ruts. The animus needs to be separated and purified of these extraneous collections of ideas and thoughts that diminish its spiritual light. What the Rosarium is showing us is a radical process of separation from material and spiritual attachments that keep us from the truth of the self. As we will see in the last pictures, the process does arrive at a state of total transformation. In picture 14, titled Fixation, you see the united pair again, but now stripped of their wings, and the spirit is flying upward into the heavens. Again, the text reads, "Here ends the life of Luna, and the spirit subtly ascends on high. Here total silence and darkness prevails. It is nighttime without a visible moon. Fixation means that a new state of stability is being prepared. And in the meantime, there is no movement, not even on the cellular or molecular level. The void has been entered. No sensations, no thoughts, no images. The spirit flying upward has departed for advanced exposure to the divine realm of the self. It will return later and vigorously, but for now, all is silence. This is a necessary stage in this individuation process toward union of anima and animus. A new identity is forming and needs to be fixed in place. Picture 15, which is titled Multiplication, mirrors picture number 8, Washing, and again signals the preparation for the return of the flown spirit. The androgynous figure lies quietly in the tomb and receives the fertilizing rain from above. It is a picture of approaching springtime or the dawn of a new day. The second round of transformation is nearing completion. The text reads, "Here the water is diminished, and bedeweth the earth with his moisture." In practice, one might receive a dream of pregnancy at this point in the process. The waters of life are washing the body of the united couple. And in picture number 16, we see the return of the enlivening spirit that had departed a few pictures before. This is a dramatic image. The returning soul is large and strong and intent on re-entering the lifeless body in the grave. One thinks of the song, "Morning has broken like the first morning," famous folk song. The image is about to break into celebration, as we shall see in the next picture. The text reads, "Here the soul descendeth gloriously from heaven and raiseth up the daughter of philosophy." Aurora is on the horizon. Luna, who has died in picture 14, will be reborn as the daughter of philosophy. That is, as a spiritualized anima. Her orientation has been completely changed, and the animus is now woven into her identity, intimately and permanently. In picture number 17, we see the triumphant result of this second phase of the transformation process. This is the solar rebus. which is, in a sense, the complement of the lunar rebus in picture number 10. The solar rebus, however, is more commanding and robust than the lunar rebus. This is more than a mere complementary version of the earlier rebus image. It's much more complete and developed, more whole, more powerful. By comparison, the first rebus was pale and bloodless, as the moon is by contrast with the sun. This picture represents the alchemical rubedo, the reddening when the brilliance of alchemical gold makes its sudden appearance in the alchemical process. The text for this picture reads, "Here is born the King of all glory. There cannot be any created greater in the world than he, neither by art nor nature." It is extremely surprising, therefore, that the series does not conclude here. The sun has risen, Sol is in the heavens, and everything looks perfect and complete. Is this not the peak and summit of psychological and spiritual development? Animus and Anima are united in a single figure. The lion and the serpents and the self-sacrificing pelican are all contained and under control. But there is still one more stage of development to go. And again, it involves death and rebirth. In picture number 18, we see the green lion is devouring the sun. This looks like a bad scene. The sun doesn't look too happy to be swallowed, and blood is flowing. But this is a necessary development, a final baptism in the mercurial waters. Solar consciousness is going down into the unconscious, where a further transformation will be put into operation. The text tells us something about the lion. "I am the true green and golden lion without cares. In me all the secrets of the philosophers are hidden." The green lion is Mercurius, and in his belly lies the gnosis sought by the alchemists, with which they could repeat their transformations with other materials, could turn all metals into gold, could cure all illnesses and heal all wounds. These are the secrets of nature hidden in the mind of God. Psychologically, it is the wisdom of the self. Jung writes in Mysterium Conjunctionis, volume 14, collected works, quote, "Mercurius demonstrably corresponds to the cosmic nous of the classical philosophers. The human mind is a derivative of this, and so likewise is the diurnal life of the psyche, which we call consciousness," unquote. This is a picture of intense introversion, and it takes Sol into a heavenly realm which we witness in picture 19, the divinization of the human figure, shown here without a crown, signifying reduction of the personal in favor of the elevation to the archetypal. This symbolizes the simultaneous humiliation and elevation of identity in preparation for the final statement, the resurrected body, which takes up the transformed human image in a statement of triumph over death. This analogy to the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday caused anxiety among the church's theologians and priests who proceeded to declare alchemy a heresy, that is, a false and misleading teaching. But as psychologists, we would say that the process lends itself to the possibility of archetypal inflation, which Jung called the mana personality. It is a danger not to be minimized, but it can be avoided as long as the images remain impersonal and related to as archetypal and not personal images of identity. The theology of the church followed the same archetypal pattern as the alchemists did in their projections, and both result in a transformation of body, soul, and spirit. The new being that theology speaks of is the hidden Christ within. The text reads, "After my passion and manifold torments, I am again risen, being purified and cleansed from all spots." This represents the final product of the alchemical process. Now, one could very well say, this cannot be achieved in this lifetime, such an incredible series of transformations. And perhaps it is achieved only after death, as might be concluded from the last three pictures of the series. Some people have indeed claimed that death is the final conjunctio and results in a definitive transformation. This is when the human personality that has been housed in the mortal body is transformed into an immortal form, the way Christ appeared when he rose from the dead. The form was that of the earthly body and its identity, but it was made of non-material substance. It was a subtle body, the same body, but a subtle body that could pass through material objects like doors and walls and was not subject to gravity. This is what Dante reports in the Divine Comedy of his body experience as he journeyed through heaven in the final stages of the Divine Comedy, the Paradiso. On this side of the great divide that is death, we may think of this subtle body as a type of enlightened consciousness. If someone does achieve in their lifetime, even momentarily, such a transformation, they would testify to being at one with the self. This means that their normal dualistic mind, which distinguishes the ego from the objects in the surrounding environment and the inner world from the outer world, is drastically changed, and consciousness has reached an overview of the opposites that transcends their discrete boundaries that mark separation. In other words, if solar ego consciousness and lunar unconsciousness become merged into one state of mind, psychological wholeness has been achieved. Sol is united with Luna, Animus with Anima, and consciousness embraces both heads in one body. And I will conclude my lecture there and invite you to make comments, ask questions. We can have some discussion for the next half hour. And any points that you would like to have clarified, I'd be glad to do my best. Thank you for your attention.
Murray, muito obrigado pela tua palestra, essa imensa incursão no mundo alquímico que nos traz, me parece, várias questões importantes. Então, vamos combinar o seguinte, quem quiser fazer perguntas para o Murray, ele vai poder ficar aqui até 15 para meio-dia, coloque um nome no chat e eu chamo, tá? Murray, eu queria começar com uma curiosidade. No volume 16 das obras completas de Jung, quando ele escreve o texto Psicologia da Transferência e usa as imagens, as gravuras do rosário, ele vai somente até a gravura 10. Ele não vai até a 20, como você mostrou aqui. Há uma razão, há um sentido para essa escolha? Queria te ouvir a respeito.
That essay, The Psychology of the Transference, was supposed to be the first chapter of Mysterium Conjunctionis. And he published that separately in 1946 while he was working on Mysterium Conjunctionis. And so it was like the first chapter of the great mysterious union that he writes about then in volume 14. So in the psychology of the transference, he's discussing a particular clinical issue, the transference. And he uses the first 10 pictures of the Rosarium to discuss a kind of union that takes place at quite an unconscious level, that level C at the bottom of the diagram that he makes, between the unconscious of the client and the unconscious of the doctor. So the doctor's anima and the female patient's animus unite and form a rebus, a kind of mutual self between them. And this produces what Jung called kinship libido, a very strong connection between the analyst and the analysand. And Jung left it there. For the purpose of transference, the first 10 pictures were enough. But then when he gets into discussing the full range of issues that are involved in uniting the king and queen, he does that in Mysterium Conjunctionis, a very big book, and especially in the last chapter called The Conjunction. And in the conjunction, he talks about separation of the soul from the body and union with the spirit that we see in the Rosarium that form unio mentalis. That's what Dorn's language, Gerhard Dorn, the alchemist, 17th century alchemist. That's the first stage, the union of the soul with the spirit. That's described vividly in these Rosarium pictures, but Jung does not go back to the Rosarium. He refers to it occasionally, but now he's using Dorn. Then there's a second stage of transformation of Dorn is the union of this back with the body, and that's the soul returning to the body that you see in the pictures and enlivening the body. Now the body is transformed, so you have body, soul, and spirit in a new being. That would be like picture number 17, the solar rebus. And then the final stage is the union with the unus mundus that Jung writes about, and that's the last three pictures. Jung doesn't use the pictures for that purpose, but you can see that's in the back of his mind. So in a sense, he interprets the whole series, but using different alchemical language. But he's really working through these 20 pictures, as I see it, in that last, it was his last book, Mysterium Conjunctionis. And there he talks about the union of the king and queen, the sun and moon. There's a chapter on the sun and moon, the king and queen, Adam and Eve, so on. Very interesting. So if you take these pictures and what I lectured here, and you read Mysterium Conjunctionis side by side, you can see all the connections underneath. It's very interesting. Thank you for that question, Marcus. Very good.
Murray, só fazer mais uma questão que me parece relevante. Você acha que a partir dos anos 30 da obra do Jung, ou mesmo no período em que Jung começa a pensar a alquimia, é nesse momento que ele realiza a cisígia Anima, Animus no seu pensamento? Por que eu estou dizendo isso? Seria possível a gente pensar que ao longo da obra dele há momentos, por exemplo, o livro vermelho, onde ele é mais tomado pela ânima, e outros momentos como tipos psicológicos, aonde ele é mais dotado pelo ânimos. Ou seja, é na alquimia que ele consegue fazer a conúncio? É possível fazer essa afirmação?
That's also a very interesting question. I've studied the Red Book quite a bit, and you can really see that he gives himself over to the anima there. he calls out, "My soul, where are you?" Then she appears, and then he relates to her through the whole book. For the next 15 years, he's involved in fantasy work, which is the Anima world. Anima is dreams, active imagination, fantasy images. And while he's doing that, he's also reflecting on it and interpreting it. And that's that combination of picture, fantasy, interpretation that you have in the Red Book. So yes, you're right. He was very involved with the Anima after he wrote his commentary on Miss Miller's fantasies. That's volume 5 of the collected works, the Symbols of Transformation. And then he broke with Freud. And he used this, his capacity for fantasy, or active imagination, as he called it, in order to enter into a relation to the soul. So active imagination was his method of giving himself over to the Anima and listening to her, listening to his imagination, paying very careful attention, really relating to it in a very serious way, and leaving the spirit of the times behind. He left his persona behind, his animus ideas. He really gave himself over to this process. And out of that, he created his psychology. Analytical psychology comes out deeply out of this experience that he had. So it's a psychology that is itself a blend of anima and animus. As you say in psychological types, very thinking, very much animus oriented. And other writings that are much more feeling oriented or anima oriented. Then in 1944, he had you remember, he had a heart attack in the hospital. And while he was recovering from his heart attack at night, he had these tremendous visions that he writes about in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And those are visions. He writes about, he says he had 3 visions of conjunctio. One was from the Kabbalah, Teferet and Malkut, masculine and feminine figures uniting in a wedding ceremony. Then there was Zeus and Hera, which is a great Heros Gamos in Greek mythology. And then there was Christ and his church. So there was Kabbalistic, mystical, there was Greek, mythological, and Christian mystical, you could say Christian mysteries. And he said these visions, afterwards when he wrote about them, he said that they were much more than his active imagination, much stronger. He said they were the most real thing he ever experienced. He said they were absolutely real, and they set him on his journey toward writing Psychology of the Transference and the Mysterium Conjunctionis. He had those visions in 1944. He published the Essay on the Transference, 1946, and Mysterium Conjunctionis, 1955-56. So that's all woven together. So his conjunctio experiences were in the Red Book time, but also then very powerfly when he was in his 70s or late 60s, 1944. I think he was 69 years old or so. And that all went together to form his own experience of this transformation that he writes about. What he found in alchemy was a language to talk about his experience in a way that was, it was, on the one side, it's esoteric and it's a bit strange. On the other hand, it's the forerunner of modern science. So alchemy was sort of a combination of science and active imagination. And I think what he liked about it so much was that the alchemists worked with material objects. And it wasn't just in their heads. You know, philosophy is a product of thinking. And if you think abstractly without experience, it gets unconnected from the anima, it gets unconnected from the psyche. And a lot of philosophy is like that. It's thinking about thinking. So if you're a student of philosophy today and you become a philosopher, you think about Plato's thinking, you think about Aristotle's thinking, maybe you think about theological thinking, you're thinking about thinking. You aren't thinking about experience. Jung was focused on thinking about experience. So he had to have the experience. And he looked around, he said, who else had experiences like this? Am I the only one who has these kind of experiences? And then he found alchemy. And Richard Wilhelm's gift to him, 1928, The Secret of the Golden Flower. And this was Chinese alchemy. And Jung read it, and he was amazed. He said, these people were having the same experience I'm having in the Red Book. Who are they? And then he started studying alchemy. And there had been a previous writer, Silber, an early psychoanalyst, follower of Freud's, who wrote a book on alchemy and mysticism. And Jung had read that. So that was also in the back of his mind. So then he turned to the alchemical writings, which are extremely difficult to read. And he made himself a notebook, several notebooks with the terms. He looked up all the terms, how they were used, made himself a dictionary, and began studying the alchemical writings and interpreting them. And there he found an account of transformation process that was archetypal. So now he could say the archetype is not only an image, a static image or an idea, but it's a process. There's an archetypal process of development that underlies the individuation process. And you can see that in the alchemical pictures and philosophy based on their imaginal experiences in the laboratory using physical objects and material. And that really, for Jung, was a wonderful gift to speak about his experiences through the lens of Western philosophy and history and many other people's experiences, the alchemists. Then he connected that to the experience of his patients, like Wolfgang Pauli's dreams that he writes about in Volume 12, Psychology and Alchemy, interpreting dreams using alchemical process and images. So it became really his major interpretive tool for reading the meaning of this difficult thing that we call the unconscious. You know, you've got dreams that are so difficult to interpret and a series of dreams. And if you have some handles to grasp what's going on in the unconscious process that's unfolding, and you can interpret that to your patients, it helps them to connect to their own individuation process. So that's how he used alchemy, both in his practice and in his writing.
Obrigado, Murray. Vou abrir para as perguntas, tá? Liliana, por favor, você fez duas perguntas. Você não quer condensá-las em uma e apresentar para a gente? Liliana Waba.
Hi. Hi, Murray. So I am very pleased to see you, to meet you online.
Nice to see you.
I would prefer in person, maybe next year, let's see. Vou fazer a pergunta em português. Está sendo traduzida? The question is translated?
Okay, that's fine.
Ok. Eram duas perguntas. Uma se refere ao símbolo do hermafrodita, que o próprio Jung mostrou que não era o final, que era um momento do processo. E a cisígia, que me parece, a meu ver, eu pergunto para o Murray, são diferentes? Eu vejo como diferentes, mas muitas vezes na literatura são tidos como iguais. Então, hermafrodita seria um tipo de compreensão psicológica e se exija um outro tipo de compreensão psicológica, ou ele vê semelhantes. Eu entendo que no hermafrodita há ainda uma fusão e na cisígia há uma conjunção, uma complementação de diferenças que se unem. Mas eu queria ouvir o Moraes sobre isso. A outra era que Jung classicamente, let's see one by one.
Okay. The word syzygy was unfamiliar to me until I read Jung's book Ion, and chapter number 3 in Ion is titled The Syzygy, and that's where he writes about the Anima and the Animus. And if you look up syzygy in the dictionary, it's a conjunction. It's actually an astronomical term. When the sun and the moon are in a certain alignment, or two stars are in a certain alignment, it's called a syzygy. They're lined up with each other. But Jung uses it in a psychological way as showing the underlying connection between animus and anima. So, and he makes reference to the Platonic idea of the original man, like Adam, in the Bible. First there's Adam, and then Eve comes out of Adam. So first they're united, then they're separated, and then they unite again. So the second union is not the same as the first. The first union is undifferentiated, unconscious merge. We would say a merger, like an infant and a mother. There's a merger. Our participation mystique is a merger. But then as you become conscious, differences appear. So say twins are born, a boy and a girl. They're very close to each other. They share each other's genetic code. They share each other's psyches practically. They can think for each other. And then at a certain point, maybe in adolescence, they separate and they become two individuals. And that's what happens in the syzygy, that there is a division. So first it's one, then it separates into conscious and unconscious. So one of these two becomes identified with consciousness, the other stays in the unconscious, and then they can reunite, we say, in the second half of life. So first union, then separation, then reunion. Now, the hermaphrodite is a symbol of the reunion. When the Rosarium series begins, you see the king and queen very separate. They've achieved a very separate identity, and then they unite and they become a hermaphrodite, you could call it, or androgynous. Now, in psychology, what do we mean by androgyny? There's a lot of debate about that these days because of the whole gender confusion among young people. Am I a boy? Am I a girl? Do I want to be a boy or a girl? So the gender question is very ambiguous and vague. But we would say it's necessary to separate and form a clear identity first, and then reunite on a psychological level. And in the second half of life, for a man, that usually means becoming more anima-oriented, as Jung did in the second half of life. The Red Book is the beginning of his second half of life, his midlife crisis experience. Then he connects to his soul. My soul, where are you? I lost you, left you behind. Now I want to reconnect with you. So you see that. And in a woman's identity, maybe she identifies with the feminine, becomes a mother like you have, Liliana. The career is put on hold for a while. Nowadays, maybe not, but and then you return to your career, your children are raised, and you integrate the animus and you write books like you have. That's what Jung saw as development, individuation in the women around him. They almost all wrote books. They They're very intelligent women, some of them educated, some not so much. But they got very involved with their mind. You know, animus means mind or spirit. It doesn't just mean the masculine gender. It has very little to do with that at a certain level. And when you can unite mind and feeling and eros, eros is connectedness, poetic sensitivities, sense of beauty, and you connect that with your mind, then you have a whole personality. You can go to one side more at a certain time in certain contexts, more to the others. And that's what we look for in people in the second half of life, to develop what's been left out. We start with the shadow, then we move to the anima and the animus, and then we gradually approach union with the self that Jung, that's the last picture, or the last pictures, which goes beyond, as you said, it goes beyond the hermaphrodite, beyond the syzygy, into another state altogether, that union with unus mundus that Jung writes about at the end of Mysterium Conjunctionis. So thank you for the question. What's your second question, Liliana?
Bom, a segunda está pouco relacionada porque eu entendi que a sua posição é como alguns pós-jungianos de sair do clássico Jung, ânima no homem, Animus na mulher, e considerar ânima e Animus como instâncias arquetípicas em ambos. Ou seja, a identidade feminina pode também ter esse inconsciente que não é self e que é ânima. Então, ânima e Animus em ambos. Seria uma posição, meus alunos me perguntam. E se este tipo de pensamento mais atual ajudaria a compreender o transgênero? Era essa a pergunta.
Oh my, that is a really big question. In my experience, I haven't worked with any transgender persons per se, but I've supervised a couple of cases of transgender people. To me, it often sounds like confusion, but there are instances of transgender, that is, people who change their gender biologically at a certain stage of their life to conform with what they feel their psyches to be like. There's a famous case called Jan Morris. Was a man, John Morris, became a very well-known travel writer, wrote about Venice and Trieste, beautiful books. And during the First World War, covered the battles and things. Was married, had a couple of children, and then around the age of 35 or 40, decided that he was going to have the transgender operation and become a woman. So he had the necessary chemicals and did whatever they could at that time. This was in the 1950s, I think, or 60s, or maybe even earlier. And was very satisfied, stayed with his partner, his woman partner, his wife, continued raising the children as a woman, and was very satisfied with that. Now his body more carefully matched his feelings about himself. So he didn't identify strongly with his male body, apparently, even though he functioned as a male until midlife, and then he made the change. I don't know what Jung would have said of that. He probably would have said, well, can't you just do that on a psychological level? Do you have to literalize it and concretize it? But when you speak to these people, they say, I'm a woman in a man's body, or I'm a man in a woman's body, and I want my body to fit my body image. And I know it's very difficult to talk them out of it if you try. I wouldn't even try. I would just listen, and I would pay attention to their psychic image of themselves. And what they're trying to do is make their literal physical body conform to a psychic image. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it works, and sometimes they do it and they want to come back. It doesn't work. So it can be, if it's done too early and in a state of confusion, and because a lot of other people are doing it, you know, and it's very popular and cool thing to do, it can be a disastrous mistake, just acting out of confusion. So I would want to take it slow and let them mature in the body that they've been given biologically before they make that decision. But I think you're right. It's good if we can think of anima and animus not tied so strictly to biological gender, but as types of archetypal energy. The one more feminine, not female, but feminine, lunar, and one more solar, active, one more receptive, one more feeling, one more mentally active, and then let people, you know, in analysis, we start with where people are. We don't try to impose our views on them. We try to hear what the psyche is saying. And if after listening for a long time, the psyche says something that even goes against what we think and feel, we tend to go along with the program that the self is offering. But I know it's very difficult and there are some instances where you really, I know there was a case of a person whose body image was a man with only one leg. He had 2 legs, he was healthy. And he wanted to amputate one leg so his physical body would conform to his psychic image of himself. So he invested money in having an operation to amputate a healthy leg so that his physical body would conform to his psychic body. Now that to me is very bizarre, and I would have a hard time going along with that. It looks to me pathological and deep need of interpretation, but apparently he couldn't be interpreted out of it or talked out of it, and went ahead and did that. So, and apparently this happens frequently. He wasn't the only one to have some sort of physical operation to make the body conform to a psychic image of the body. I don't have answers to that, but I try to listen to whatever clients bring. I think maybe we have time for one more, Marcus, and then I'm going to have to stop.
Eu vou pedir compreensão do Cláudio e da Cris pelas perguntas. A Leda também, por causa do horário, a gente não vai conseguir fazer, e acho que algumas perguntas já foram respondidas nessa questão que o Murray trouxe. Murray, queria te fazer uma última questão. Em 1982, você editou esse livro, Análise Junguiana, que é uma coletânea de textos teóricos e clínicos sobre o pensamento junguiano. Em 2010, você editou Psicanálise Junguiana, que foi traduzido para o português, né? Psicanálise Junguiana, que também é uma coletânea de textos sobre a clínica, sobre a prática. Qual é a diferença da análise junguiana para a psicanálise junguiana? Aonde foi que esse termo psicanálise junguiana nasceu? É um termo que no Brasil provoca muita controvérsia. Então, eu queria saber a tua opinião sobre.
The difference is 5 letters, B-S-Y-C-H, psychoanalysis. That it came about gradually in the 1990s, early 2000s. And at first I found it offensive because it sounded like Jungians were trying to join forces with Freudians, which I don't think is a terribly good idea. I believe in collaboration and communication, but not borrowing terminology or trying to be like the others. But the problem with Jungian analysis, I found personally, when people would ask me, well, what is your profession? and I would say Jungian analysis, they thought it was some sort of chemical. Oh, do you work for a chemical company or pharmaceutical company? What is Jungian analysis? They didn't see it as anything to do with psychology, psychotherapy. And so it became easier to identify oneself as a Jungian psychoanalysis. Now, the Jungian adjective that modifies psychoanalysis is very important. If you just call yourself a psychoanalyst, immediately you are considered a member of the IPA, the International Psychoanalytic Association, of which Jung was the first president, incidentally. Jung was first a psychoanalyst, and then he became a Jungian. Through his Red Book experience, he became a Jungian, having immersed himself in the unconscious and finding out what's really in there and how deep it goes. So it's important that we use the word Jungian. It's also a brand name. Some people want to call themselves analytical psychologists. So you could say Handbook of Analytical Psychology instead of Jungian psychoanalysis. Analytical psychology is a term that Jung used for his psychology starting in, I think, 1914 or so. But sometimes he also changed to complex psychology, which some people say he preferred complex psychology because of his theory of complexes. And in Britain, they shy away from using the word psychoanalysis because they've really established a hierarchy of statuses in England, sort of a class distinction, and they wouldn't use the word psychoanalyst. So they call themselves analytical psychologists, pretty much in England. In the States, we called ourselves Jungian analysts, and then, as I say, gradually over time, Jungian psychoanalysts caught on, and I titled that book Jungian Psychoanalysis fairly early in that development. And then nowadays, pretty much everybody that I know, with the exception of people in the UK, refer to themselves as Jungian psychoanalysts. Not everybody, but I think it's sort of taken hold, and it's now the term of choice. I'm comfortable with it. And I find it's easier to identify myself that way because people know what psychoanalysis is. Say you're a Jungian psychoanalyst, they might not know the difference between Freud and Jung, but they hear, at least you're in a ballpark. They know the field that you're in. And they say, usually, oh goodness, I better not say too much, you'll see right through me. You know, they think analysts can see everything. We're as blind and stupid as everybody else in reality. So, okay, thank you, Marcus. It's been a pleasure to be with you. And I wish you all the best in your very active endeavors in Brazil. Thank you for the opportunity.
Murray, queria te agradecer em nome do Tiaços, meu, da Luciana Ximenes, da nossa querida tradutora Isa, uma companheira fundamental para o nosso trabalho. Agradecer a tua gentileza de ter aceito o nosso convite, a tua colaboração e a oportunidade de sempre poder aprender contigo. Espero que tenhamos novas oportunidades em breve. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Marcus. Bye-bye.
Pessoal, obrigado pela presença. Oportunidade incrível de ouvir Murray Stein ao vivo, disponível para poder responder as nossas perguntas. Ele estava com tempo um tanto quanto curto. Eu peço desculpas para a Leda, para o Cláudio, para a Cris, que não puderam fazer as perguntas. Fica para a próxima, tá bom? Semana que vem, né, Luciana Ximenes, temos... Quer falar, Lu?
Vou falar. Francisco Bosco, às 14h30, falando sobre os diálogos possíveis.
Tá. A gente vai abrir o Tiaços para fora do campo junguiano. Vamos trazer o Francisco Bosco, que é um filósofo, para falar sobre o livro dele, que é um livro fundamental. Então, Tiaços também é política, sempre foi.
Pode entrar.
Então, fiquem convidados, sexta-feira, 2 horas.
É para além do mundo junguiano, mas vai ser um teatro um pouco diferente, né? Porque ele vai apresentar um pouquinho o livro, e depois os junguianos vão trazer para o universo também, fazendo as perguntas, né?
Todos convidados desde já, tá bom? E não esquecendo, fora Bolsonaro, tá?
Fora Bolsonaro.
Fora, sempre.
Fora!
Fora Bolsonaro.
Fora!
Bem rápido. Beijo.
Fora Bolsonaro!
E todos os deuses te ouçam, Marcos. Os de cima, os de baixo, os do lado.
Fora Bolsonaro!
Até a próxima, gente. Um abraço.
Tchau.